The studio lights were brighter than usual that night, or at least that was how it felt to everyone sitting beneath them. The air inside the television studio carried a nervous energy, the kind that only appeared when millions of eyes were watching in real time and no one knew exactly what might happen next. Cameras glided silently across polished floors, red lights blinking like unblinking eyes. While technicians whispered behind glass walls, the audience had come expecting laughter, charm, and nostalgia. What they didn't know was that they were about to witness something far more enduring than entertainment. Dean Martin sat calmly in his chair, hands resting loosely on his knees, his posture relaxed but attentive. He wore a familiar smile, not the exaggerated grin people expected from performers, but the quiet, knowing smile of a man who had lived long enough to understand that not every moment required a response. To most viewers at home, he looked effortless, almost casual. But those who truly knew him could see the depth behind that expression. That smile wasn't armor. It was understanding. Across from him sat the host, a man known for sharp wit and sharper remarks. His reputation had been built on pushing boundaries, on catching guests off guard, on getting reactions that would trend the next morning. Ratings loved him. Producers trusted him. And tonight, he had clearly decided that Dean Martin, an icon, a legend, a symbol of a different era, would be his target. The host leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping a stack of cue cards as if rehearsing the moment. His smile was polite on the surface, but there was an edge beneath it, a hunger for control. He glanced briefly toward the camera, aware of the millions watching, and then turned back to Dean. "So, Dean," the host began, his tone light but pointed, "people say you've had it easy. Fame, success, admiration. Some might even say you never had to work very hard for it." A ripple moved through the audience. Not laughter, something tighter. Anticipation mixed with discomfort. Dean didn't flinch. He didn't shift in his seat. He simply looked at the host, that same calm smile resting on his face, eyes steady, patient. He had heard variations of this question before, dressed up in different words. Asked by people who mistook longevity for luck, the host continued, sensing the tension. "I mean, let's be honest. You were always the charming one, the funny one. While others struggled, you just smiled your way through it." The subtle insult wrapped in humor, the implication that kindness was weakness, that grace was laziness. For a brief moment, silence settled over the studio like a held breath. Dean's smile widened, not mockingly, not defensively, but gently, as if he were listening to a child explain the world for the first time. Inside him, memory stirred, not anger, not pride, just reflection. He remembered the early days when stages were cold and audiences were smaller, when rejection letters piled up and doubt whispered late at night. He remembered standing in smoky rooms, singing to people who barely looked up, learning patience one note at a time. He remembered friendships tested by pressure, by jealousy, by the weight of expectation. None of that had been easy, but none of it had hardened him either. The host waited. Cameras zoomed in, eager for a reaction, a comeback, a defense, something sharp. Dean simply nodded once. "Slowly, he said at last, his voice warm and unhurried. "I've always believed that everyone carries their own kind of work inside them." The simplicity of the sentence caught the room off guard. He continued, eyes still on the host, but his words seemed meant for everyone listening. "Some people carry it loudly. Others carry it quietly. Just because you don't hear the noise doesn't mean the weight isn't there." The audience shifted. A few heads nodded. The tension began to change shape. The host chuckled lightly, trying to steer the moment back toward humor. "That's a very diplomatic answer." Dean's smile never faded. "I've found diplomacy saves a lot of energy," he replied. "And energy's something you learn to protect." A soft murmur spread through the audience, now not laughter, not applause, but recognition. Behind the scenes, a producer glanced at the monitor, sensing that the conversation was no longer unfolding the way it had been planned. The host felt it too. The control he had expected to hold was slipping. It's not because Dean was fighting him, but because Dean wasn't fighting at all. The host adjusted in his chair. Still, he pressed, "Don't you ever get tired of being, well, agreeable? Don't you ever want to push back?" Dean leaned back slightly, folding his hands. For the first time, his smile softened into something more reflective. "When you spend enough time pushing back," he said, "you realize you're still pushing. And pushing keeps you tied to the thing you're resisting." The studio fell completely silent. He looked out toward the audience now, then toward the camera, his gaze steady and inclusive. "I'd rather stay free." That was when something shifted, not just in the room, but in the story being told. This was no longer an interview. It was a lesson unfolding in real time. The host attempted another joke, but it landed flat. The audience's attention was no longer with him. It was with the man who had just turned a moment of attempted humiliation into a quiet demonstration of dignity. Dean. Martin didn't raise his voice. He didn't correct the host harshly. He didn't expose anyone. He simply stood in his truth, unshaken, letting kindness do what force never could, as the cameras pulled back for a commercial break. Applause finally erupted, not the loud, programmed kind, but the kind that comes from something being understood deeply. Collectively, Dean rose from his chair briefly, offering the host a courteous nod. No bitterness, no triumph, just respect. And in that moment, his smile said everything words never needed to. The applause lingered longer than anyone expected. It wasn't thunderous at first. It began in scattered claps, hesitant, almost unsure of itself, like people checking whether they were allowed to feel what they were feeling. Then it grew, not louder so much as fuller, richer, until the sound wrapped around the studio and pressed gently against the walls. It carried something rare for live television: sincerity. Dean Martin stood just off camera as the show cut to commercial. The studio lights dimming slightly while crew members moved with practiced urgency. Assistants adjusted microphones. Stage managers whispered into headsets. Somewhere behind the curtains, a producer's voice rose and fell, sharp with agitation. But Dean heard none of it clearly. He never needed to. Years in the industry had taught him how to recognize turbulence without stepping into it. The host, on the other hand, felt it immediately. He laughed a little too loudly as the cameras went dark, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off a joke that hadn't landed. "Well," he said, glancing toward a nearby producer, that took a turn. No one answered him. Dean noticed the pause not with satisfaction, but with awareness. Silence had always been more revealing than words. He buttoned his jacket slowly, deliberately, as if the pace itself were a statement. There was no rush. There never was. A young production assistant approached him cautiously, clipboard held tight to her chest. "Mr. Martin," she said, her voice a mix of nerves and admiration, "we'll be back live in 3 minutes." Dean smiled at her, the same gentle smile, unchanged. "Take your time," he said kindly. "I'm not going anywhere." She nodded, visibly relieved, and hurried off. Across the stage, host leaned toward one of his writers, his voice lowered but tense. "Did we clear that line?" he asked. "The one about him being lucky?" The writer hesitated. "It was on the card. That's not what I asked." The writer glanced at the floor. The answer was obvious. For the first time that evening, doubt crept in, not the kind that makes you reconsider a joke, but the kind that makes you reconsider yourself. The host had built his career on quick wins, sharp edges, moments that cut just enough to draw attention without spilling blood. But something about Dean Martin had refused to bleed. Worse, it had reflected. When the red light blinked back on and the broadcast resumed, the energy was different. The audience sat straighter. Conversations hushed faster. Even the cameras seemed to move more carefully now, as if the studio itself had become aware that something meaningful was happening. The host cleared his throat. "Welcome back," he said, smiling for the camera. But it wasn't the same smile. It was tighter, less certain. He turned toward Dean again, trying to reclaim momentum. "You know, Dean, some people might say you're very good at avoiding conflict." Dean tilted his head slightly, considering the words. He didn't answer immediately. That pause, that calm, intentional pause, did something strange to the room. It pulled people forward. It made them listen not just for sound, but for intention. "I don't avoid conflict," Dean said at last. "I just don't invite it to sit down and stay." Few people in the audience laughed softly. Others nodded. The host blinked, momentarily thrown off. But surely the host pressed, his tone edging toward insistence. "There must have been moments when you felt misunderstood, undervalued. Moments when you wanted to set the record straight." Dean leaned back, eyes drifting upward for a fraction of a second, not in search of a clever reply, but of memory. "There were moments," he said quietly, "when I was told who I was supposed to be." The room stilled. "And moments," he continued, "when I was punished for not being that person." No names, no accusations, just truth laid gently on the table. He looked back at the host. "But here's what time teaches you," he said. "If you spend your life correcting every misunderstanding, you never get around to living." The host laughed again reflexively, but it came out hollow. The audience didn't follow this time. Behind the scenes, social media monitors were lighting up. Clips were already being shared. Quotes were being typed out in bold letters. Not because Dean had said anything shocking, but because he had said something steady. A veteran cameraman, who had worked hundreds of shows and seen every kind of ego imaginable, murmured to a colleague, "That man's not here to win. That's why he is." The interview continued, but the balance had shifted completely. Every attempt by the host to provoke now felt smaller, thinner, like stones tossed at a mountain. Dean answered each question with the same composed presence, never defensive, never dismissive, just grounded. At one point, the host tried a different angle. "You've been called outdated," he said, half smiling, a symbol of a slower time. Dean chuckled softly. "Slower doesn't mean weaker," he replied. "It just means you notice more." That line landed harder than anything else, because suddenly the audience wasn't watching a celebrity being tested. They were watching a man who had survived decades without surrendering his core. A man who had learned that strength didn't need to announce itself. As the final minutes of the show approached, the host glanced at the clock, then at Dean. For the first time, there was something close to hesitation in his eyes. "Well," he said, forcing a grin, "this has certainly been enlightening." Dean smiled warmly. "It's been a conversation," he said. "Those usually are." The closing applause came quicker this time, stronger, unmistakable. When the show ended and the lights dimmed for good, the host stood, extending his hand. There was a beat, just a fraction of a second, where pride and humility wrestled in his expression. Dean took the hand without hesitation. "Thank you for having me," Dean said sincerely. The host nodded. "You're different than I expected." Dean met his gaze, still smiling. "Most people are." As Dean walked toward the exit, crew members watched him go. Some smiled. Some looked thoughtful. One young intern wiped at her eyes, surprised by her own reaction. No speeches had been made. No battles won. And yet, something powerful had happened. A moment meant to diminish had instead revealed, and outside the studio. In living rooms, in late-night diners, in quiet bedrooms, millions of people sat with the echo of a simple truth. You don't have to raise your voice to be heard. You just have to stand where you are and not move. The night did not end when the studio lights went dark. That was the illusion most people believed, that moments lived on television existed only within the frame, fading as soon as the credits rolled. But some moments refused to stay contained. Some moments slipped through screens, followed people home, sat quietly beside them long after the noise was gone. This was one of those moments. Dean. Martin stepped out into the cool night air behind the studio, the hum of the city wrapping around him like a low, steady breath. The applause was gone now. The cameras were gone. All that remained was the quiet rhythm of his footsteps and the distant glow of streetlights stretching down the empty road. His driver opened the car door, nodding respectfully. "You all right, sir?" Dean paused for just a second before getting in, looking up at the sky cloudless calm. "Yes," he said simply. "More than all right." But inside him, something was stirring, Not pride. Not triumph. Reflection. He had felt it during the interview, even before the host realized control was slipping. That subtle shift in the air, that collective stillness. Dean had recognized it because he had felt it before. Many times in his life when people stopped waiting for performance and started listening for truth. The car pulled away, merging into traffic, unaware that somewhere inside the studio, panic had quietly taken root. Back inside, the host remained seated long after the audience had left. His tie lay loosened against his collar. His smile gone, replaced by a furrowed stillness he didn't quite recognize. Around him, staff members moved cautiously, as if sound itself might provoke something. Phones buzzed nonstop. Screens glowed with scrolling messages, notifications multiplying faster than anyone could keep up with. The producer approached, tablet in hand. "We've got a situation," she said carefully. The host exhaled sharply. "Let me guess." "People loved him," she nodded. "They didn't just love him, they connected." That word landed heavier than any criticism. Clips were already spreading. Short ones. Quiet ones. Dean's pauses. His smile. The way he never raised his voice, never pushed back the way people expected. Comment sections weren't arguing. They weren't divided. They were reflective. I felt like he was talking to me. That smile stopped me mid-scroll. He didn't embarrass anyone, and somehow that was the most powerful part. The host rubbed his temples. "That wasn't the plan," the producer said. "It wasn't." Across the city, far from studio lights and production meetings, the ripple continued. In a small apartment, a woman sat alone at her kitchen table, laptop open. The clip replaying silently as she stared at Dean's face frozen on the screen. She had spent years defending herself at work, fighting to be heard. Exhausting herself trying to prove she belonged, she watched Dean smile again. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the need to explain herself. In a quiet diner, a night shift cook leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Eyes fixed on a phone propped beside the register. He had learned long ago that raising your voice only got you labeled. He had learned to swallow his words. Dean's calm presence did something unexpected. It reminded him that silence, chosen not forced, could be strength. Back in his hotel room, Dean sat by the window, jacket draped over the chair, city lights blinking below like distant stars. He turned off the television without checking the replay. He never watched himself afterward. He had learned that lesson early. Instead, he poured himself a glass of water and sat quietly, hands folded, letting the night settle. There was a knock at the door. Dean opened it to find an old acquaintance, a fellow performer. Face lined with years of success and regret mixed together, his expression was unsettled. "I saw the show," the man said without preamble. Dean stepped aside. "Come in." They sat across from each other, silence filling the space easily. "You could have crushed him," the man finally said. "Everyone expected you to." Dean smiled faintly. "Then they would have learned the wrong lesson." And the man shook his head. "Do you know how many people wish they'd handled things the way you did tonight?" Dean's gaze softened. "It took me a long time to learn," he said, "and I learned it the hard way." The man leaned forward. "You changed something tonight?" Dean looked out the window again. "No," he said quietly. "I reminded people of something they already knew." Elsewhere, the host sat alone in his office, replaying the moment not on a screen but in his mind. Dean's smile, not mocking, not superior, understanding. It unsettled him more than anger ever could, for the first time in years. He questioned whether being sharp had made him strong, or just loud. Whether winning moments had cost him something deeper. Whether he had mistaken control for confidence. He opened his phone, scrolled past praise, past criticism, until he found one comment that stopped him cold. "He didn't humiliate you. He showed you mercy." The host set the phone down slowly. That night, Dean Martin slept peacefully. The host did not, and in homes, cars, late-night shifts, and quiet corners of the world. People carried that moment with them not as entertainment, but as permission to stop explaining. Permission to stand calmly in their truth. Permission to smile not because they were weak, but because they were whole. The ripple kept moving, and no one, not even Den, could see where it would finally land. Morning arrived gently for Dean Martin. There was no urgency in the way sunlight crept. Through the thin curtains of his hotel room, no blaring alarms or frantic calls demanding his attention. The world had moved overnight faster than it ever seemed to during the day. But Dean woke with the same calm he had carried into sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment, hands resting loosely on his knees, listening to the distant hum of traffic below. It sounded steady, grounded, alive. He didn't reach for his phone. That alone was unusual in an era when news traveled faster than thought. But Dean had learned long ago that meaning arrived whether you chased it or not. Some truths needed time to breathe. When he finally stepped outside later that morning, the city felt subtly different. Not louder. Not brighter. Just aware. A few people recognized him on the sidewalk, offering small nods, soft smiles. No one rushed him. No one asked for explanations. It was as if something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that didn't need words. Back at the studio, the atmosphere was anything but calm. Executives crowded into glass-walled conference rooms, voices overlapping, fingers tapping, screens filled with numbers and charts. Engagement had soared. Clips from the interview were outperforming anything the show had released all year. But the metrics told only part of the story. Emails had begun arriving, long ones, not the usual praise or outrage. These were personal, thoughtful, vulnerable. People wrote about moments when they'd been interrupted, belittled, dismissed. About arguments they'd won and relationships they'd lost. About how watching one man refuse to retaliate had forced them to sit with uncomfortable questions about themselves. The producer who had first warned the host now stood at the head of the table. "This isn't just viral," she said. "It's resonant." The host sat silently at the far end, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the polished surface of the table. He hadn't slept. He hadn't replied to messages. He hadn't joked once. "I thought I was in control," he finally said. His voice quieter than anyone in the room had ever heard it. "I thought I knew how these moments worked." No one contradicted him. Later that day, he did something no one expected. He asked for Dean Martin's number when the call finally came. Dean was sitting alone in a small cafe, stirring a cup of coffee he had no intention of finishing. He answered without hesitation. "Dean," the host said, clearing his throat. "I don't know if you remember me." Dean smiled, though the host couldn't see it. "I remember the conversation." There was a pause, long, honest. "I didn't handle that night the way I should have," the host said. "And you didn't handle it the way I deserved. You handled it better." Dean listened. He always did. "I wanted a reaction," the host continued. "You gave me a mirror." "That happens sometimes," Dean said gently. "If you're willing to look." Another silence followed, this one heavier, but cleaner. "Thank you," the host said at last. "For not turning me into the villain of my own show." Dean's voice remained steady. "We all get enough of that on our own." When the call ended, Dean sat back, exhaling slowly. There was no sense of victory, only completion. Days turned into weeks. The clip continued to circulate, but it changed shape as it traveled. Teachers shared it with students. Managers played it in meetings. Parents watched it quietly after their children went to sleep. It became less about a celebrity and more about a choice. The choice to remain calm when provoked, to remain kind when misunderstood, to remain whole when pressured to fracture. Dean was invited to speak, to comment, to explain. He declined most of it instead. He returned to what he had always done best, showing up, singing, listening, being present. Because legacy, he believed, was not built through statements, but through consistency. One evening, months later, Dean attended a small private gathering. No cameras, no scripts, just conversation. Someone brought up the interview, laughing softly. "You know," they said, "that moment will outlive all of us." Dean considered this, then shook his head. "No," he replied. "The moment isn't what matters. What people do after it, that's what lasts." Somewhere else, the host stood on a different stage. introducing a guest with a tone noticeably changed, softer, more curious, less sharp. He still asked difficult questions, but now he listened for answers instead of reactions. People noticed. Not because he announced it, because he didn't. That was the real legacy of that night. Not the smile, not the silence, not the applause, but the quiet realization. Shared by millions, that strength doesn't always shout. Dignity doesn't need defense. And kindness, when chosen deliberately, is one of the most powerful forces a human being can carry. Dean Martin never tried to teach that lesson. He simply lived it, and the world for once was ready to learn.